Well, hello. I'm real excited tonight. Fisher's History Chat. It's not necessarily Fisher's history, but it's really close Indiana history. So that's pretty good on that. So all the way from the Philippines, we have Bob Hotalan, who was a classmate of mine, not I mean a nearby classmate. At Noblesville High School, and he's also the author of this book. It's called A Hoosier in Andersonville. And Bob, I'm going to tell you a secret. This was not an easy book to read. Not because of the writing. The writing was fine. It's all your great grandfather's personal diary entries in here. It was a tough place to be. So we hear about. It's one thing to read about history, but it's something else to read about it in someone's own words. Somebody was there and experienced it. So tell us about this book. What got you to write it, and go from there?
It gets a little graphic, I guess, especially for the time period. He doesn't hold back exactly what he saw and what he experienced, and there are some very detailed things that are not necessarily pleasant to read. But it was reality of the war. He entered into the war in 1862. He joined up voluntarily, as most guys in Indiana did. There was virtually no draft in Indiana because everybody volunteered, so they didn't need to really draft anyone. They were the 90th Regiment to volunteer, he was from outside Franklin, Indiana, a little town called Clarksburg. But most of the 90th were all from that area: Claremont, Franklin, Greenwood, that whole area. So not really Hamilton County, but very close. They mustered in Indianapolis in 1862 and were sent to Louisville. And the first 2 years, they were pretty much just I guess, scouting type group. They did follow John Hunt Morgan and were involved with the capture of John Hunt Morgan, but for the most part, they were just a scouting and gathering group for the Union Army throughout Kentucky, mostly. And then in 1864, they were actually assigned then to General Sherman's group and started their march into Atlanta. So that's when things got really interesting. He was part of General Stoneman's group, who Stoneman had convinced Sherman that he could leave Atlanta, march to Andersonville with this idea that he could free the prisoners that were already in Andersonville. But it was very much a failed attempt, poorly planned, not enough men, had no idea, even if he had been successful, how he would have been able to transport those prisoners. Just a very bad idea across the board. But when they got to Macon, just outside, about 60 miles out of Andersonville, they were turned back by the Confederate forces. And on their way marching back, trying to get back to Atlanta, they were captured and then all became prisoners and spent next 6 to 8 months in Andersonville. And it's pretty much, the book is pretty much his diary prior to their capture, as well as his actual what he witnessed day in, day out. And then later on, the diary was returned to him, and he made notes about 5 years later, kind of recalling some of the things that went on prior to and then after the war. So it does get very detailed, but very interesting read.
Well, it's a fascinating read. Here's a quote from him that you have on the back of his book. It says, "I have no great actions to boast of, but I will endeavor in my way," which in a way all of my own, to write you some anecdotes, give you some ideas of how we fared, what we did, what we'd seen, and how we'd seen it. I do not propose to give you a history of the war or a history of the prisoners in the South. I was a prisoner. It was, he did a really good job of showing you the day-to-day, what they were dealing with.
Yeah, he actually did keep it on a day-to-day diary. And I think one of the more interesting parts of the book is the exact word for word as he wrote it from the diary. So you're getting exactly as he wrote it. But as you read through it, if you pay attention, each diary entry gets smaller and smaller and smaller because physically he was deteriorating very quickly from lack of food, poor health, a lot of other issues. And so basically he was just too weak to continue writing long journal entries. So by the end, they were basically like 1 day, 1 sentence journal entries. But I think the kind of the other sad part, which continues into the book, is after the war, he came back home, was in very poor health, both physically and mentally, and eventually was put into Central State Hospital, where he lived the last 25 years of his life in Central State Hospital under medical care. Basically completely suffering from what we now know as PTSD, never really got his mind mentally out of the war.
Yeah, he ended up passing at Central State, did he not?
I'm sorry?
He ended up passing at Central State.
Yes, he died in 1910. Strangely enough, on 10/10/1910, in Central State at the age of 78. And he's buried in a cemetery in Clarksburg, which, like I say, Clarksburg is about 15 miles east of Greenwood in Johnson County.
Yeah. I was going to say, as you were telling some of the story there, I was in there, my 2 times great grandfather was in the 80th Volunteers from Indiana, and he was out of basically out of Lagodi, Shoals, Martin, and Davies County is where all of those guys were. And they were in some of those. He was with Sherman heading down to Atlanta, and then they end up going all the way to the coast. Fortunately, he got diverted away apparently, so he didn't go to Andersonville. But it was they were in a lot of the same battles, and all I have is I can go into the 80th Infantry and see the battles they were in. I know when he was mustered in and what mustered out. So I know what battles he was in, but I don't know anything about him personally. The only thing I have is an anecdotal thing from an older cousin who knew my great grandmother better than I did. And apparently she talked about her father-in-law who used to come home drunk so much that his mule got him home, which, when I think of the battles that he was in and what he saw, if that's all that happened to him, that's pretty good. So, it was pretty brutal stuff.
It's interesting when I was researching the book and reading some other books around just to get some ideas. There's a very good book out by, I'm trying to think what, Eric Dean, called, what is it? Something Over Hell. I've gone blank, but anyway, Eric Dean, and he has basically it's all about all the psychological and emotional trauma that the post-war guys went through, but it's also concerning Vietnam and other wars. But he has a very, very large section on Civil War, and it's amazing that these guys survived a war, but really mentally, emotionally could not survive life after.
Well, I was reading, incidents of them having to stand on bodies 5 deep, in trenches, still fighting, and you couldn't step on a piece of turf that didn't have a body under it. I mean, your fellows or the gray, whichever. It's hard for us today to get our heads around what these people saw.
Oh yeah, yeah, and the fact that they're literally fighting against Americans. I think that was one of the big mental things that people had a problem with. When they talk about it being brother against brother, in certain cases it literally was. The other thing in this that I found in reading his diary was interesting was he entered the war with no concern about slavery, and it wasn't about slavery in his opinion. He basically said he didn't care one way or the other concerning slavery. It was more, in his opinion, about keeping the country united. So I don't know if that's always the case with Northern versus Southern, but in my research, I did find that it had a tendency that more Northern soldiers seemed to feel like it was more of a keeping the country unified than it was a slavery issue.
Well, they always say that John Adams said this, that every war you've got 30% that are passionately for something, 30% passionately against, and the battle is actually for the 30% in the middle, because most people really don't pay that much attention to what's going on, so it's, and my assumption is that number has never changed since the dawn of man.
Well, I think that's probably true, and I think Indiana was unique in its own, in the simple fact that Governor Morton was such a strong advocate for Lincoln and the whole northern side of the war, that maybe measuring Indiana against the whole rest may be difficult, because I think there was for some reason, a greater patriotism, maybe led by Morton, to be involved with the war, not necessarily for the cause, as it was just the fact that they wanted to support Morton.
Yeah. So what, when you're doing this research, I mean, you had his diary, and then where else did you dig into to find things to supplement that?
Well, what's interesting, oh, the book, by the way, for Eric Dean was Shook Over Hell, was the name of the book. I was trying to remember.
Okay.
Whoops, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I see you.
Sorry. I actually started this years ago when we were in, my grandmother is the one who had possession of the diary. It was her grandfather, Erastus Holmes was her grandfather, and her father kept all of his belongings after the war. We still have his kepi hat, his belt, the diary, a couple of buttons off his uniform, etc. And she kept all those and then passed them on to my father, who he then took the diary, which is only about the size, a little bit bigger than a cell phone, and he studied it for a long time, trying to interpret the handwriting to finally convert it over so we could then use it. So that started when I was in junior high. And then when I got into college, my research for my degree, I had to do a deep research, and it was on the prisons of the Civil War. So that kind of continued more of my research onto him, as well as all the other prisons. And then I just decided at one time, I think it was time to finally put it all together. So lots of trips to Indiana State History Library and Andersonville. I actually went to Andersonville Prison and the Andersonville Museum and got information, and just lots of research to find out more information. Not really couldn't find out much about him individually, because like he was just a soldier, quartermaster sergeant, but for the most part just a soldier in the war. But did find out a lot about the 90th Regiment and the whole Stoneman March into Macon, and then of course learning more about Andersonville. So then through the help, and with lots of help from the Indiana Museum, they have possession of all the medical records of Central State. When Central State closed up, they took possession of all the medical records. So I have literally the complete medical file of him from Central State Hospital. So that was very helpful too, because to be able to get his pension, they have to have witnesses claiming what they feel like his problem was, why he deserved pension. And every year they have to provide that witness statement. So all in that medical file, all the witness statements as to how they perceived him to be, not only his doctor, but also neighbors, his family, and other things. So that helped a lot also.
Oh, very good. Well, I would imagine, unless somebody is a history, nerd or whatever, really into it, they probably have no idea just how horrific these POW camps were during the Civil War. Just the death tolls and the stuff that was in it. So if you want to elaborate a little bit on what he experienced in there.
Well, roughly 13,000 men died in Andersonville in the roughly 9 months that it was open. That's the weird thing. I think people have this perception sometimes that Andersonville started when the war started and it went on for a long time. No, it did not start till late in the war, and it was relatively a short time period. And to have 13,000 prisoners die is pretty hard to swallow sometimes. But so in that measurement, it was the worst of all the Civil War prisons. But at the same time, the North wasn't exactly free of problems either. You had Camp Morton in Indianapolis, which was the Indiana State Fairgrounds at that time, which was near downtown. They have a sign, a historical marker on Delaware in downtown Indianapolis but pointing out that's where Camp Morton was located for Confederate prisoners. And those prisoners who died there are buried in Crown Hill Cemetery. They have a big, huge memorial and marker in Crown Hill for all the Confederate soldiers who died at Camp Morton. Elmira in New York was pretty rough. Camp Douglas in Chicago, and Johnson's Island in Sandusky, Ohio, were all pretty brutal in the fact that Southern soldiers weren't really ready for the northern winters. And so they had a very difficult time surviving in some of these outdoor open air prisons. Even though Camp Morton really wasn't open air, they used the horse barns and other buildings as protection. It was still very much open. Andersonville was the worst in the South, but there were others, Salisbury, and quite a few others in the South. But Andersonville is by far the worst. And what he witnessed there, as well as what others witnessed, and lots of other diaries out there to read, were very graphic and very hard to imagine seeing. He saw a young man who, excuse me, in Andersonville, there was a brook or a small creek that ran from one side of the prison to the other, and it was used as the only water source for the whole prison. So it was the water for drinking, cooking, bathing, bathroom, everything. So you can imagine a short period of time that water became very pollutant, very non-usable for the most part. And so a young man one day was trying to reach across what was known as the deadline, a marker within the prison walls that they were not allowed to cross. And as he reached across, his head passed over the deadline, and one of the guards literally shot the top of his head off and killed him right there. And so he very, very graphically details what he saw in that as an example. Literally sawing men dead and dying every day. He was on duty as one of many to carry out dead bodies from within the prison. And he said in one day they carried out over 19 bodies just one day alone. And he had witnessed at one time they counted over 100 bodies one day being carried out. So, yeah, it was just mentally would be very difficult to see. And then on top of that, there was virtually no protection from the weather in Andersonville. They built from their clothing or whatever scraps of material they could find or whatever to build some type of small huts or tents. But for the most part, it was just an open air sewage. And a death pen for the most part.
Yeah, 13,000 people in 9 months. That's pretty brutal. That's a lot of people every day. So
yeah,
it's kind of one of those things. It's like we gloss over a lot of our own history and what goes on. We think of Auschwitz and we think of things like that. We don't really realize just how brutal things could be here. I don't have definitive stories, but I've got a chance, study my own family history, and I've studied about the 2 times great grandfather that was on some of the journeys with your horse, but his great grandfather, so the 4 times, and I couldn't figure this out, but I've read enough books to go, okay, that might explain this. He was a Marine surgeon in the Revolutionary War, and was captured on a British prisoner ship. And he survived, which 11,000 people died on those ships, so very few people survived. But then I was reading in a book on those prison ships that if the British wanted it to be as bad as possible because they wanted to scare people from getting into the military. They wanted to keep them from being too afraid that they could end up in this situation. So if they got anyone that had any, corpsmen, anybody had any medical thing that could possibly make life easier for the prisoners, they would immediately trade them for soldiers to get them out of there. So that might explain why he survived that thing. I mean, I don't know this for a fact, but piecing
Yeah.
pieces together, that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you got to wonder, I mean, obviously many, especially in Andersonville and other prisons, died from weather conditions, poor food, poor health, and so forth. But then you wonder, why did others survive? I mean, it's crazy. And then, to be fortunate enough to have a diary of one person who survived with very detailed information is always helpful. Always feel sorry for the families and people who had relatives who survived Andersonville and then died on the Sultana on their way back home when the Sultana blew up in the Mississippi River. And it's like, could you imagine going through all that, surviving through Andersonville, and then have something like that happen? It's crazy how the things go like that.
Yeah. So, maybe his diary is what helped keep him alive.
Maybe. Of course, he had a wife and 2 children back in Indiana. So maybe, he had an incentive. I think one of the interesting thing with him too is the surgeon for the 90th Regiment was John Wishart. And of course, if you know anything of that area, Wishart Hospital, which is now Eskenazi Hospital, was the Wishart family, and the doctors of the Wishart family started the hospital. And so when Holmes came back home and needed medical attention and eventually going to Central State, his chief medical evaluator was Dr. Wishart. And in fact, they were distant cousins. They shared great grandmothers. Their great grandmothers were the same person. So we do have a little bit of a tie, I guess, distantly to the Wishart family.
Well, that's interesting. I have a quest to still go down to the records and try to find things on Wishart on Central State's medical records. I found a 2 times great grandmother who died there in 1901 of pernicious pneumonia, which I guess now vitamin B takes care of. But I don't know if she even spoke English because she was from Germany. Okay. She was 46 years old. Was she in there because she was postpartum? Who knows? I mean, so I'd love to go find out more detail on that. But the signing doctor on her death certificate was Dr. Wishart.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So he was practicing, well, wasn't really a member of the staff at Central State, but he was very much involved with lots of that went on in Central State. But what people don't realize is Central State was never set up to be long-term care. Its original purpose was short-term and get people more like a rehab center almost, and get people back home. And Holmes was actually one of the very first patients to be admitted as a long-term care patient at Central State. Of course, eventually Central State turned into long-term care, but that was not its original purpose when it was set up. But one of the, when you talk about the book, and one of the interesting quotes that he had, I thought, in his evaluation of the war was, he said, when we started the war, some of us thought we would be back in 6 months, covered all with glory. We ended up covered all with vermin and dirt. And as for the glory, I, for one, after 5 years, have seen no glory for me or men like me. So his mental capacity was actually pretty good for quite a while. It just deteriorated, obviously, as he got older and older. He and his wife moved in with their daughter and her husband, my great grandparents, and they tried to take care of him for as long as they could, but he just mentally could not really cope with life in general. He would actually go out into the backyard of their home and did a reconstruction model, fairly large from what I understand, of Andersonville prison, and would literally stop people on the street and bring them into the house and into the backyard and try to tell them all about Andersonville. And then at times, my great-grandfather would take it apart and he'd go back out and rebuild it again and start all over again. So, and then Dr. Wishart, in one of his medical evaluations, basically said that Holmes was not, although never a problem as a patient, he never really got out of the fact that he kept saying that he needed to escape and rejoin Sherman and to continue the march. So it eventually took its toll.
Yeah, it's just, he got out, but his mind never got out. So it was.
Yeah, it just never really. And unfortunately, when my full interest to all this took place, my grandmother had died, so I never really got a firsthand account from her. But I do know that she did go out and visit him at times at Central State. She was 16 when he died, but I know that she had gone out and visited him at times, but I never ever got a firsthand account from her as to what she actually said or talked about maybe with him.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating book. If anyone has not, if you've not read it, I'm going to strongly recommend it. If you're interested in this time frame and this stuff, this is an excellent book. It is, again, Bob, it's not an easy one to read because your great grandfather had a pretty rough experience there, and he was more than
But I think it's
willing to let you.
good to have these histories and these firsthand accounts, and hopefully never get lost. To give myself another plug, I guess I do have a second book. It's about a Confederate brigadier general, and it's kind of his life story and his actual true accounts of what he witnessed throughout the war too. Obviously not directly involved with Andersonville, but he was involved in a lot of major battles, got captured twice, wounded 3 times. So, and it's called "I Am a Good Old Rebel." So, if somebody's interested on the Confederate side, there is a
He's also
book
your great grandfather, isn't he?
No, he wasn't mine, but
Oh.
when my first book came out, one of the people I worked with, it was her great grandfather, and William Payne is his name. And he was from Warrenton, Virginia, and he was a very close friend to John Mosby. And so, yeah, he was almost what I refer to as the Confederate Forrest Gump of the Civil War, because he met and was involved with virtually anybody known from the Confederate side of the war.
What was the name of that book again?
It was called "I Am a Good Old Rebel."
Okay. So that is also available like on Amazon or what have you?
Yeah, I'll take a cheap plug there.
Yeah, I appreciate it. That's good for me. Well, Robert, I'm so excited to do this. This was a lot of fun. We'll get this video out to all kinds of different places and stuff, and hopefully people will pick up your book and read it. It's quite the story from a Hoosier's perspective, and so it's definitely history here. Thanks for getting up early for us, and they're in the Philippines. We did wait until you have to get up. You have to do it at 8 o'clock rather than 7 o'clock. So if we waited for the time change here.
For the time change.
Yeah, so that worked out good, but I appreciate it. Maybe we'll do one on the other book later.
Okay, well, I thank you very much for your time, and take care of that leg.
All right. Well, yeah. So I am up and functioning. I do have my cane here, so I can get around with. So I have a brand new bionic hip now. So anyway, I will talk to you guys later, and thank you so much.
Okay, take care, sir.
All righty. Bye bye.